So hello everybody, thank you for taking the time to join us today for our third session during Black History Month. I'm really delighted to actually introduce to you Dr Muna Abdi. As well as being a speaker and a friend of the institution, we actually both were in Sheffield some time ago, and she's been doing some amazing work, and I thought it was a great time to sort of like, well, for me to get some learning in terms of how we can actually be more inclusive generally, but also the key challenge that we face, which is more about anti-racism within the society that we live. So I'm going to just give you a quick introduction to Muna. Muna is a founder and director of the MA Education Consultancy. Muna holds a PhD in education and a variety of experience in education over the last 10 years, including research and community engagement. Our innovative approach to research and engagement uses sharing circles and community contracts to redefine what it means to actively participate. The approach has been used to develop community-centered research, co-created curricula, and restorative practice programs. In addition, Muna is really busy. Muna has worked in a variety of higher education institutions, charities, and commercial organizations to offer support and guidance in regard to racial literacy, leadership, training, and many, many more. Thus, helping these organizations to learn, apply, reflect, embed, and most importantly, sustain anti-racism and racial equity practices into their structures, policies, and procedures. Her main aim as an individual and as a leader within her field is not only to increase the awareness and understanding of being an active participant within education, professional, and also social settings, but also highlight the importance of disrupting and dismantling systemic and institutionalized racism across the board. Dr. Abdi's work and organization creates opportunities and spaces to provide meaningful, equitable, and inclusive practices that reinforce the significance of gradual implementation, flexibility, and reflection, and practical guidance as well. So it's a real honor to have the opportunity to have a conversation with Muna, but obviously first and foremost, I do believe I have a presentation that I can sit back and have some learning from. So please, over to you. Thank you.
Ollie, thank you so much for the invitation to speak and for the kind introduction. It's really lovely to be with you all. The presentation that I'm sharing with you today is really a discussion around language, a conversation that myself and colleagues who work with us at MA Education have been having over the last few months about the need to shift the language that we use and to consider the language that we use in our anti-racist practice so that we are acknowledging the way in which language shapes our actions. And so what I want to share with you today is just some of the key terms that we engage with in our practice, both with the institutions that we work with, as well as our own self-reflection in the work that we engage with, and offer up a space for us to really interrogate some of those terms and to think about what we can use as alternative to those terms in order to really name purposefully what we are doing as anti-racists within the spaces that we're in. I am going to use a presentation just as a stimulus. Anybody who wants to take a screenshot of any of the slides, you're more than welcome to. This is a public space, but I would ask you to just acknowledge that these are intellectual contributions by a number of colleagues who have engaged with us. So please respectfully cite that this is work that has been done by MA Education Consultancy and its collaborators. What I want to start off with before we have a look at the language around anti-racism specifically is to think really carefully about the language that we engage with within our own institutions around inclusion more broadly. And these are terms that we sometimes use interchangeably and sometimes use without offering up a definition or an explanation of the terms. And so I want us to just spend the first couple of minutes outlining what we mean when we're referring to diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice, specifically in the work that we do. Diversity in its simpler sense just means having those with marked differences in the shared space. And those marked differences can be defined in a number of ways. It can be physical marked differences when we're talking about race, gender, so on and so forth. Again, these are socially constructed ideas of difference. But it can also be as broad as difference of thought, difference of experience, etc. And then when we think of inclusion, what we're referring to is how those individuals with those marked differences experience a space. They experience a space by feeling valued, feeling as though they are welcomed, that they belong, etc. Many of the organizations that we work with in their quest to make their organizations inclusive start with the basis of diversity. And what we often have to reiterate is that inclusion is not the natural consequence of diversity. And what we mean by that is you can bring people into a shared space, people with marked differences into a shared space, and that shared space doesn't automatically become an inclusive space for those who are within it. So it's really important for us to acknowledge why we are engaging in work around diversity and recognizing that that does not ultimately lead to a space being inclusive, and asking ourselves the questions of what do we need to do in order for a space to become inclusive. The statement that we often say to the clients that we work with is that it is not inclusion if you're inviting people into a space that you are unwilling to change. So if the space itself isn't interrogated, if the conditions of that environment are not challenged or changed, and you are inviting individuals with marked differences into that space, the dynamics, the power dynamics remain fixed. The advantages and the disadvantages that are embedded within that space remain fixed. And so it doesn't become an inclusive space. All it becomes is a diverse space that is still exclusive to particular groups of people. And then we have a look at the language of equality, equity, and justice. This is a really helpful diagram to use in any teaching space that you're working with. And we often don't include the third image around justice. But when we're engaging in anti-racism work, it's really important for us to acknowledge the distinction between equality, equity, and justice in the work that we do. Equality is based on the assumption that if you give people the same resources and the same tools, they'll be able to access a space and they will be able to reach the same outcomes. Equity recognizes that there are systemic barriers that affect people in different ways. And rather than giving people the same resources and the same tools, you give them what they need, the support that they need, the resources that they need in order to be able to access a space and access it despite the systemic barriers that they might have to encounter. The work around equity is a responsive piece of work. It's responding to the systemic inequities that we acknowledge affect people in different ways. When we're engaging in anti-racism work, we acknowledge that the work around equity is important, but what we're striving towards is work that centers justice. And what we mean when we talk about work that centers justice is that we're not wanting to just engage in the measures that are around acknowledging those disproportionate barriers and responding to those disproportionate barriers, but we're also thinking more long-term and more broadly about how we remove those barriers entirely. How do we remove those systems that are disadvantaging people so that we can eventually get to a place where we no longer need equitable measures, where the issues around inequity are being addressed and everybody can freely access a space and engage in that space in a meaningful way. It's really important that we don't ignore the need for this work to be about justice essentially, because sometimes what can happen is that if we focus specifically on the work around equity, we become complacent in the long-term requirements of this work. And these terms are also really helpful for us to think about how we question the spaces that we're in and how we ask particular questions of those spaces. Often within our institutions, we ask questions that are primarily around diversity and sometimes around inclusion. So when we ask questions around diversity, we're often asking who's in the room and how many of a particular minoritized group do we have this year as opposed to last year. We're looking at data, we're looking at representation in the space. And these are important questions. But when we are only focusing on these questions, we're not looking at the conditions of the environment that we're bringing people into. When we ask questions that are around equity alongside questions around diversity, we're not just asking who's in the room, we're also asking who's trying to get into the room but can't, and whose presence in the room is under threat of erasure. Who do we have in the room that doesn't feel safe in that room or doesn't feel heard or a sense of belonging? And not just asking in terms of data about how many more of a minoritized group do we have this year as opposed to last year, but asking the fundamental questions of Why are we needing to have these interventions to bring into the space people with marked differences? What are the conditions that we've created or that have been created in the environment that we're in that mean that certain groups are the perpetual majority in the space? And likewise, when we're asking questions around inclusion, these questions are often about having a unified single experience. Has everybody's ideas been heard? Does everybody feel safe in the space? And it doesn't always take into consideration the different dynamics of safety and the different dynamics of inclusion that affect different groups. And so when we ask questions that are around justice, it allows us to look at inclusion with a much more nuanced lens. So the questions around justice would ask not just has everybody's ideas been heard, but whose ideas won't be taken seriously in a space if those individuals are still not in the majority. So an example of this would be if you are wanting to diversify a leadership board and you bring in one person who's a person of color into that space, you may have that person in the space and you may offer up the space for that individual to speak and be heard. But if that person is still not in the majority in that space, is their voice being valued? Are their ideas being valued in the same way? And then also when we ask the question of safety, we rarely refer to these spaces as safe spaces because it's impossible to guarantee safety, psychological safety for everybody in the room because people are coming to the space with different experiences and different experiences of that space. And so the questions that we ask are often around justice. Whose safety, when we think about the notion of safe spaces, is often having to be sacrificed or minimized in a space in order for others, often the majority in that space, to feel comfortable enough to maintain views that are prejudiced. So asking ourselves the question of when we are constructing these safe spaces, whose ideas of safety are we constructing it around? Because safety is a very subjective term. So I invite you, first of all, before we even have a look at the language around anti-racism, to really think critically about the language we use within our institutions and how we can start to ask the questions that offer more nuance and that shift our focus away from sometimes the superficial questions around representation, which are helpful starting points, to questions that look at the complex dynamics and the conditions of the environments that we're inviting people into, or that we are bringing people into. And then I want us to think about how we define anti-racism. The language of racism, the language of anti-racism is really popularized in many of our spaces, but there isn't a clear definition that's often used to define what we mean by anti-racism. And so what I want to offer up is a definition that I use in my own practice that allows me to just clarify how the definitions themselves allow us to translate that into practice. In order to define anti-racism, you must first be able to define what we mean by racism. And racism is racial prejudice backed by institutional control. It's not the mainstream definition of racism that we see, which is discrimination on the basis of skin color. The reason why we don't use that definition is because often when we think about discrimination, we think about prejudice that is acted upon, and we think about it through an individualized lens. We think about it as an individual who is choosing to act upon their prejudice. And the reason why we talk about racial prejudice that is backed by institutional control is because it recognizes that racism is actually a complex interplay. It is held by the individual beliefs that we have, the prejudices and the biases that we hold, but it's also fundamentally held in place by our shared values and ideologies, the things that we see around us, that we hear about particular groups of people that become normalized in our spaces, that form stereotypes that we hold. And it is embedded in our institutional practices. And so the definition that we use of racism really has to capture the multiple dimensions of how racism functions and that complex interplay. And likewise, when we're thinking of a definition of anti-racism, it is the direct opposite of that. It's a response to racism, and it is an action. Anti-racism is the act of disrupting and dismantling racism in all of its forms. And when we say all of its forms, we're reminding ourselves of the many layers of how racism functions. Anti-racism requires us to take stock of and eradicate the policies that have racist outcomes. I'm putting an emphasis there on the word outcomes, because often we don't pay attention to the measurable impact of racism and how we respond to that measurable impact. It is about actively opposing the idea of anti-racism is not passive, it's active, by advocating for changes. Advocating and educating are extremely important in anti-racism work. And one of the reasons why we always start off with a definition of racism and a definition of anti-racism is because this is a really powerful way of us acknowledging and recognizing how we position ourselves in the spaces where this work is happening. Definitions are important because they anchor us to particular principles. When we are able to name what racism is, and when we are able to name what anti-racism is with a clear definition, it allows us to start to see where we position ourselves. If we don't do the basic work of defining the kinds of people that we are, the kinds of work that we're engaging with, we won't be able to have stable and consistent goals in our action. We're going to fall into the trap of making ambiguous and really broad claims or commitments that are not actualized into practice and cannot be held accountable for. And so it's really important as a starting point that we're really clear on what it is that we are naming and what we're willing to commit to. Ibrahim Kendi makes a really beautiful quote in defining what we mean by the importance of language and the importance of definition as a starting point in this work. And he says, to be an anti-racist is to set lucid definitions of racism and anti-racism, racist and anti-racist policies, racist and anti-racist ideas, and racist and anti-racist people. To be a racist is to constantly redefine racism in a way that exonerates one's changing policies, ideas, and personhood. When we think of definitions as being ambiguous, this is one of the tools that is used to maintain racist structures. The ambiguity of language, the shifting of language, the lack of clarity that exists within some of the terms that we use allows us to shift that language away from our own responsibilities. And so it's really important that if you are committing to anti-racism work, your starting point is really setting a very lucid definition of what you mean by what you're responding to and what you're working towards. Sometimes in our attempts to name the dynamics of racism that we're wanting to challenge, we tend to adopt the language that is already available to us. We adopt language that is mainstream. We adopt language that is used within our sector or used amongst our peers. But without critically analyzing that language that we're using, sometimes we can fall into the trap of using language that actually places hierarchies in the work that we're doing, the same hierarchies that we are committed to and making the intention to try and dismantle. And so I'm going to unpack a couple of those terms that we use that unwittingly create hierarchies in this space. Sometimes the language that we use, even with the intention to bring people together, can be used to separate us. And when we're doing anti-racism work, we always try and emphasize that this work is around the impact of what we do and not the intention of what we do. You can be well-intentioned in your efforts, but without being informed and without taking the time to critically reflect on the work that you're doing, you can still fall into the trap of engaging in practices that are inherently upholding racism. Language is a tool, and as a tool, it constantly has to be re-examined for its level of purposefulness in the work that we do. The two terms that I want to spend some time having a look at with you today are the terms privilege and allyship. And there are many, many other terms that we use within anti-racism work that can also be interrogated. But just being conscious of time, these are the two terms that I want to spend some time just unpacking with you all and then offering a space for conversation. And these terms we've highlighted in a blog post that we posted, and I'd really recommend that you listen to it, that you read it, because it offers a little bit more nuance to some of the things that I'm going to outline in the presentation today. But the post that we presented was really talking about how we are trying to shift language away from privilege and allyship to understanding the root causes of the issues that we're engaging with, and how, when we do engage with the language, or if we do engage with the language of allyship and privilege, once that scaffolding, once that work around understanding the root causes has taken place, those terms can be engaged with a better understanding. It's about shifting our focus away from language that can actually present as being oppositional framings, and I'll explain what I mean by oppositional framings in a moment, towards language that recognizes our interconnected experiences. With the language of privilege in particular as a starting point, one of the reasons why we talk about it as an oppositional framing is because privilege often names what we have to hand. It names the material resources that we have. It names the advantages that we have access to, but it doesn't give any explanation for where those advantages came from. It has no origin story. And so what it does when we use the language of privilege without being informed about what privilege is that it sets an idea that there are some people who hold something and others who don't. And that is the starting point of the work that we engage with. And that isn't the starting point. When we create those oppositional framings where we position some people on one side and other people on the other side, we create a dynamic, we recreate a dynamic that is ultimately the same dynamic that systemic racism uses to hold us in positions in place. We attach privilege to individuals without exploring how it's been produced by the systems of oppression and how privilege or advantage is actually the end manifestation of how those structures and those systems have been constructed. And we often talk about privilege as if it's the cause and not the consequence of oppression. We don't think about this when we look at other forms of discrimination. And I'll explain one of those as an example. We fail to challenge our own thinking that frames the outcome of systems of oppression as a reason for the system of oppression's existence in the first place. So what I mean by that is when we think about patriarchy, we don't think about male advantage as being the reason for patriarchy. We think about patriarchy as a system resulting in male advantage. And that same logic, that same understanding can be used to talk about the dynamics of racism as a system. Racism as a system has been constructed to ensure that there is white advantage in the space. And again, if we had more time, we would unpack what we mean about whiteness, white supremacy, and white advantage in those spaces as well. But it's really, those are terms that I would invite you to unpack. When we look at the term advantage, again, we focus in on something that an individual holds. It remains fixed on that individual, and it remains fixed on the centrality of the whiteness of that individual when we look at it through an anti-racism lens. The language around privilege causes a huge amount of frustration for many people, particularly because the social understanding of privilege often is that it is about unearned advantage and unearned, to some people, unearned economic advantage in a space. And so when you have individuals in a room who identify as being from working class backgrounds, there's an immediate disconnect to the word privilege, because again, that language is locating it within them as individuals, and it's assuming something about them as individuals that may not be correct. And when we talk about the centrality of whiteness, what we're referring to is the language around privilege only focuses on those with structural advantage. And it focuses on those with the outcome of structural advantage, and it puts the onus on them to do something about it. And so the questions that sometimes arise from conversations around privilege are, what can white people do? Which inadvertently separates the individuals from the systems that they're a part of. So rather than asking the question of what does white advantage look like within our own institutions, and what can we do to challenge and dismantle some of those practices that exist within the space, sometimes the framing of privilege really narrows down to, you are somebody who is racialized as white and has access to this advantage. What are you going to do on an individual level, and separate it out from the system? And privilege often highlights the commodification of racism as racism being a system that allows particular groups of people to have access to material resources and power. in that space. And this can sometimes be a really useful starting point to mobilize people, to get them to think about what they can do with what they have, how they can start to engage in action. But it doesn't afford a way for us to that work to be sustained. It starts the action, but unless you understand what structural advantage is and how structural advantage is enabled or embedded, it's really difficult for you to just work through the language of privilege alone. And so we always start off by naming structural advantage and naming what we mean by that. Structural advantage allows us to understand the cause before the consequence. That doesn't mean you never get to a point where you're not talking about privilege or you're not talking about advantage. You absolutely can and you should, because it is the outcome of structurally enabled advantage. But you have to talk about the cause before you talk about the consequence. It connects our individual actions to the systems and structures that we work within. So again, the definition of racism is that it is held within individual actions, but it's also held within our institutional practices. And we have to ensure that the language that we use captures the interconnected nature of those two spaces. And it scaffolds our learning. When we talk about scaffolding, those of you that work within teaching will know what I mean by this. It means meeting people where they are in terms of their understanding and supporting them to be able to engage with new aspects of learning in a way that is supported. And so when we talk about scaffolding literacy, what we're talking about is if you can have people understand what we mean by structures, structural advantage, structural power, you can guide people to then understand what the outcome of that structural power is and how it affects people in different ways. You can get to a point where you then engage in language around privilege, but we would always advise that before you jump straight into privilege, you support people to understand what that privilege is emerging from. And to clearly define what we mean when we're talking about the outcome of those structural advantages. Sometimes privilege on its own is just named through a single lens. And so when we're talking about anti-racism work, sometimes individuals will only focus on what we refer to as white privilege or white advantage. But it's important to understand that anti-racism work is always intersectional. And so we don't just talk about a single lens, we talk about multiple lenses, but we talk about racial literacy as being the lens of analysis that is the one that is inherently ignored when we're looking at systemic disadvantage and needs to be prioritized. The definition of structural advantage is essentially that it is the processes, the spaces that you're able to access, the practices that you're able to engage with that protect you from the consequences of particular social burdens. If you have a particular structural advantage, you don't know you have a structural advantage until you become aware of the structural burdens that others are experiencing that you are protected from. And so somebody who has white advantage doesn't know that they have white advantage until they understand that others who share a space with them are experiencing systemic racism and anti-Blackness that they are protected from. And people have access to advantages to varying degrees because of their lived experiences, because of their intersectional identities, for many, many reasons. And it's important to know that when you meet people, those individuals are rarely going to be on one side or the other. They're rarely going to be just structurally advantaged or only experiencing structural burdens. Most people that you encounter will have a combination of the two. And so the experience on that space is a unique experience for each individual. You may have somebody who's experiencing a certain degree of white privilege and male privilege in a particular space, but at the same time, they might be experiencing class discrimination and ableism in that same space. You may have an individual who's experiencing systemic racism and homophobia in a space, but at the same time, that individual may have health and ability advantage and religious advantage in the same space. The language around structural advantage and structural burdens allow us to develop empathy, allow us to see the connections between our lived experiences, and allow us to shift our mind away from the binary frameworks that society wants us to see the world through, that structural discrimination wants us to see the world through. Sometimes the language that we use, particularly the language around privilege, is about locating advantage to particular groups of people, and as a result of that, locating disadvantage to other groups of people and separating them out. That oppositional framing of you are either on one side or the other. And with anti-racism, we try and lower those walls and recognize that those experiences are actually interconnected experiences. So if we recognize that our experiences are interconnected, that we have intersectional experiences, how do we show up for one another? How do we support one another in ensuring that everybody is able to access a space of justice, reminding ourselves of that image of we're not just striving for equity, we're not striving to just do the work of equity, we're ultimately striving to remove the systemic barriers that are affecting people. So how do we show up for one another and work through a space of justice? A starting point for many people to do this is to engage in the work of allyship. And when we looked at the language around allyship in developing the blog posts, we really tried to unpack what it was about allyship that was problematic for us in the work that we were doing. And one of the reasons why allyship is a term that we've constantly gone back and forth with to try and interrogate is because the very definition of allyship does have the nuance and the complexity that is required in this work. The difficulty is that the definition of allyship is very rarely put into practice. And what I mean by that is when we look at the definition of allyship, it's referring to a lifelong process, activities in which people with structural advantage and power work to develop empathy towards other marginalized groups' challenges and issues, and ultimately work in solidarity with those groups to create systemic change. What we found in our work and in the conversations that we've been having with many people is that the practice of allyship tends to focus on the empathy. It tends to focus on how those with structural advantage can support and help those from marginalized groups. It creates a separation between what some people can do to help others, and it doesn't show the interconnected experiences. Again, it creates those oppositional framings when this is put into practice. And the final aspect of the definition of allyship is very rarely put into practice, the work around solidarity. And there's very little unpacking of the word solidarity when we're engaging in allyship work, which can sometimes mean it doesn't have the depth that it requires. And so we try and shift the language towards solidarity so that that level of nuance is understood. There are a number of reasons why the language of allyship is problematic, and I'm just going to share some of those with you today. The term allyship plays into the idea that there is a hierarchy of oppression, rather than acknowledging that the experiences of structural advantage and structural burdens are intersectional and affect people in different ways and are interconnected in nature. The language of allyship really positions it as if there is a hierarchy, that there are some people who are just more advantaged than others, and that they have a responsibility to support those who are less advantaged than them or are disadvantaged structurally than them. It is about moral responsibility. Allyship talks a lot about morality. It is a responsibility that you have. And within anti-racism work, it often places the responsibility on those who are racialized as white to do the work of supporting others through anti-racism struggles. And because it positions those who are racialized as white in a supportive role or as a helper, it removes the self-reflection. It removes the introspective work that is required, and it separates out that individual from the impact of racism. So we sometimes find individuals who are engaging in allyship work saying, I want to help those who are impacted by racism. And our response to them is, but you are impacted by racism as well. It's a system that affects us all in different ways. But because sometimes individuals, there is a moral push or a moral onus on those who are racialized as white to do the work of allyship work, sometimes people enter into the space through a feeling of obligation or a feeling of sympathy or a feeling of guilt. And those feelings don't sustain the work. They may be a way of mobilizing people into action and for people to see the urgency of the work as a starting point, but it doesn't sustain the work. Allyship, again, because the onus and the responsibility is positioned on those with structural advantage, they often determine the conditions of the engagement. They determine what allyship should look like, and the different roles that an ally can take. So the engagement then ends up becoming optional. You have a selection of ways in which you can show up as an ally. It becomes aspirational. Sometimes allyship can become a source of intellectual curiosity. How can I be an ally by engaging intellectually with some of the ideas around what's happening, rather than it being on the social and the collective responsibility that we all have to show up for one another and to do this work, depending on where we are positioned within the work. Solidarity, by definition, requires us to relinquish power. It requires us to sacrifice. It requires us to work through the tensions and the conflicts that exist with truly working together. Allyship, because it is based on those oppositional framings of you are either impacted by the systemic racism or you are an ally in this work, there is very little interconnected relationship building that takes place. And allyship work often has very little risk for those that are engaging with it. At the most, it is the social discomfort that they experience and the encouraging of introspective work that may feel difficult for particular groups of people. But it doesn't require much relinquishing of power. It doesn't require much tension and much conflict. And again, these are optional. So some people may engage in allyship work where there are high degrees of tension and high degrees of conflict. But there are many allies who don't and still use a framing of allyship to set the intention for their work. And allyship work is often done alongside members of marginalized groups with the idea that you are there to support and you are there to help. But then that power dynamic isn't acknowledged in the collaborative space, which then results in members of marginalized groups carrying the burden of educating their allies, sharing the narratives of their trauma with their allies so that they can have that understanding of what their experience is, and then taking on the burden of holding the allies to account when they don't show up in the ways that solidarity requires of them. And so what we try and do in our work now is allow people to explore what we mean by the term allyship and how they're interpreting the word allyship in their practice, but also really encourage them to consider how they shift that towards a movement around solidarity, a movement that requires much more difficulty, much more tension. Allyship can support you to begin to set the intentions for your actions, but the real test in walking alongside and working with different groups of people is in understanding what solidarity really is in practice. There's a really beautiful quote that I want to share with you that some of you may have already seen before, by the Aboriginal activist group in Queensland, and this was written in the 1970s, but it's so pertinent for the conversations that we're still having today. And that is really asking people to be clear on what they mean when they talk about walking alongside and doing the work of solidarity. And it states, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because you understand that your liberation is bound with mine, then let's work together. If you understand and you recognize that in order for everybody to be free, everybody needs to work together, grounded in the knowledge that an injury to one is an injury to all. If somebody is affected by a particular structural burden, we can't feel safe in the spaces that we're in. And that language of safety is really important when we're talking about solidarity. What do we do to ensure that we are taking responsibility for not just our own safety in a space, but the safety of others who share the space with us as well? The work of solidarity takes time. It's difficult and it's not always straightforward. Seeking justice means putting in the work together. That word together is extremely important. Unlike allyship that sets us into positions of you're either an ally or you're somebody impacted by racism, Solidarity is a shared space. We all work through a process of solidarity, understanding where we access structural advantages and understanding where we are structurally burdened, and recognizing those nuanced experiences as we enter into this work together. We cannot do this work if there is a hierarchy of oppression, and some people only see themselves as either the helpers or the perpetrators and see others as the victims that need ongoing support. If we are to make a movement that requires us to take steps forward together, we can't do that from a place of shame as a starting point. And we also can't do that when we walk through with the language of savior. So the idea of the white savior complex. If you're doing this because you think it's your moral responsibility to help others, change isn't going to happen because you've taken yourself outside of that space of change that needs to take place. So why is language shifting important for us? The language we use names what we are addressing. It's never neutral. There's no such thing as apolitical language. Language is always intentional. And so when we are conscious of the language that we use, we are able to name the problem of racism and all of the distortions that it holds in place. When we interrogate the terms that we're using, we really get to interrogate what that term means within the context of where we are. It then allows us to build a new framework, a framework that guides our actions towards cooperation, towards compassion, towards care, and within the work that we've been doing at MA Education over the last few months, towards a love ethic, and really unpacking what we mean by working towards a love ethic in our practice. And then an acknowledgement that if we don't shift the language that we use, why are we holding on to language that does not serve us? It's really easy to stay within the familiar, to stay within language that is mainstream, to stay within language that has become popularized either within your sector or around those around you. But when that language doesn't serve you, it sits us within a space of fear. It allows us to stay away from alternatives, to ask questions about newer possibilities and things that we could be engaging with. And it means that we ensure that the culture of separation remains in place rather than bringing people together. A reminder that systemic racism and all forms of structural disadvantage are designed to separate out people. And so the language that we use really has to be language that challenges that notion and is language that is about bringing people together, that recognizes our relational experiences, our interconnected experiences, and the fact that when something happens to one person, it is as a direct result, it happens to somebody else in a very different way. So the systemic racism that somebody is encountering, another person is explicitly experiencing the structural advantage in that space at the same time. And a final quote that I want to leave you with before we open up the space for conversation. And again, this is a wonderful quote by Ibrahim Kendi. I'd really encourage you to read his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, as a starting point to the work. And he states, one either allows racial equities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist and neutrality is a mask for racism. And this echoes a quote by Angela Davis, who said the opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. Claiming to be a not racist positions you in a place of presumed neutrality, but by choosing to separate yourself out from the dynamics of racism that inevitably implicate you, you are choosing to uphold the status quo. You're choosing to uphold systems as they remain in place. So just a reminder that language isn't neutral. The language that we use to position ourselves are not neutral. And so this language is always going to be available to us, and we're always going to need to interrogate and challenge it. And the final thing I would just leave you all with is just a reminder that there's no such thing as language that is fixed. It is dynamic. And so the language that we're interrogating today solidarity, structurally enabled advantage that we are starting to shift towards may not always be purposeful for what we're trying to engage with. And that language, again, may shift in time. And that's okay. This work is ever changing, and the dynamics of this work are ever changing. And the language that we use has to move with us as well. So don't be afraid of the language that you use, but please think critically and reflect on your practice and how it's guiding and shaping and naming that practice for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Muna. That's absolutely wonderful. I mean, there were so many learning points. I'm busy scribbling away on my pad here. I don't want to take up too much time. So there's a couple of questions that I really want to actually jump to. But for me, I love the idea of, you know, when it comes to looking at racist and anti-racist perspectives together, rather than focusing on just the anti-racist. It's always good to actually embed and contextualize that in the wider system that exists. I also like the idea of the hierarchy of oppression. I had a slightly different take on that from my understanding, where we observe our society, our community willing to engage in some areas of discrimination, but then not realizing that actually, you know, if you tackle in one, if you look at all, you have a greater propensity to be successful in your undertakings rather than just focusing on the one. So for me, it was like, we see lots of people want to engage in discussions around a specific characteristic that's been discriminated against, but we don't see that taking place more widely. A quick thing that I want to kind of jump to before I go to the questions was around inclusive culture, inclusive language, which is really important. We know that there are direct relationships to individuals being able to create a sense of belonging, which then obviously leads to productivity and being part of the team. One question that I do have to start proceedings was around the idea of a lack of more formalized inclusive culture and language. What advice would you give where individuals are passionate and keen to get involved and want to do that at more local level rather than waiting for the institutional machine to actually then pick up speed and get on board? What advice or tips could you offer?
I think that the key advice I would always offer is really name what the problems are within your particular context. I think sometimes we use the language of inclusion, which is really broad, and we don't name what we're actually trying to address within our particular spaces that we're in. And also be conscious of when we're talking about inclusion, we're ultimately talking about looking at issues through an intersectional lens. And when we use the language of intersectionality, reminding ourselves that the origins of that term are looking at how race intersects with other forms of oppression, other forms of inequalities, and not separating out race from those other forms of inequalities. So sometimes the question that we get asked when we're doing this work is, you're coming in to work with an organization around anti-racism, are you also going to look at class, race, gender, etc.? And we have to explain to them that anti-racism work is intersectional. So it's not a case of doing work on race and then doing work on class and then doing work on gender. We want to be able to get to a point where inclusion and the term intersectionality are so embedded in our practice that we no longer have to use the terms that separate us out, where we almost have to think about, am I including enough of the protected characteristics in my work in order to be able to justify my work as being inclusive? The more aware we are of what our context actually looks like and the problems that we're addressing, our practice and the language that we use will reflect that as well.
And as I said, when we see sprouts happening in different departments locally, then we can actually see that then actually stimulates the wider discussion and engagement more at an institutional level. I have another point that I want to address actually, which actually looked about the idea of the structural advantage, and I've never actually thought about it in this context. Whereas that structured advantage actually protects those individuals who benefit from that privilege. I've never ever thought about it in that. I thought that was really interesting. And again, I like the way you link the two different facets of that. So what the discrimination looks like, and also the action of that leads to, and what steps should be taken. Mm-hmm. So moving on from that one, and it links into the idea about the intersectionality. I think the key question that I want to start off with is that the sentence was, I find it helpful to think about this, think about the distinction between sympathy and solidarity and their different effects on mobilization and the long-term sustainability in allyship. Should we invoke intersectionality more when talking about it and mobilizing people? And what are the obvious traps to avoid there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the intersectionality needs to be at the very start of any conversations that we're having. Where it becomes difficult is when the term intersectionality itself isn't fully understood, and it's seen as almost a number of different intersectional identities that are brought into the conversation, as opposed to understanding the different power dynamics that exist within those intersectional identities and how they manifest in different spaces at different times. And also, sometimes people engage with intersectionality through the level of literacy that they have. And so sometimes people will feel more confident in engaging with intersectionality where they're looking at class, race, class, gender, and disability, for example, because the literacy around those forms of inequalities are easier to access. They are more mainstream. They are easier to engage with because of maybe the positionalities of those who are doing the work. We always start off with the work around racial literacy, because unless you know what racism is, unless you can clearly articulate what the language around racism is, it's very difficult for you to understand what racism, what intersectionality is. And so we would always say, make sure you develop your racial literacy first, so that you have that language to be able to ground the lens of analysis of race that is required in intersectional work. But then ultimately also understand that racism is a lens of analysis, and there are multiple other lenses of analysis that need to be included when you're looking at any issue as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm going to have to make this the last question just because of the interest of time. It says, how would you suggest opening up communications in large organizations, in local government, in an area where there may be little understanding on what being anti-racist is?
I would always start the conversation with the literacy, making sure that there's space to discuss what the language is, but also data. And I think sometimes we talk about the problematic nature of data, and data isn't without its issues, but it's about offering up a space where you start to look at the evidence of the context of where you are, and really start to look at them through multiple lenses. So look at the data that you have, look at the data that is missing, because there's always data that is missing as well, and data that hasn't been acknowledged as data. And then really just start to think about how you frame the questions around power initially, and then scaffolding that into building that literacy around, we've got power, we've got structural advantage. What does that structural advantage lead into? How does it affect people in different ways? Building up that knowledge creation. And racial literacy is something that is an ongoing process. You don't just develop racial literacy at the beginning and then move straight into action. You're constantly revisiting what those terms and those concepts are throughout your practice as well. But meet people where they are is what I would always say. Look at the context, look at the data that you have to be able to evidence what that context is, and that use that as your starting point, and then build up the language so that people can more confidently engage with what the solutions could look like within that space.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I mean, we can keep going for the rest of the day. And honestly, I realize that people have other commitments, but I just want to say a big thank you again. It's been great having you and having a conversation with you today. And I really do look forward to continuing working with you over, you know, the bright future that we're creating. So thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all our attendees as well today for a great session. So take care, and we look forward to our final event next week with Katie Adikambi about cross-cultural leadership. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your days.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you.